The unexpected decision. The rhythmic ticking of the clock echoed through the nearly empty halls of Westwood Elementary School. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows as Principal James Carter made his final round for the night. The school was his second home, had been for nearly 15 years. Tonight, like many other nights, he found himself pausing in front of room 204. Inside, 5 girls sat huddled together, hunched over their books, their tired eyes flicking across the pages. Lisa, the eldest, was pointing at a complex math problem in Ellie's workbook. Mary, the bookworm, had a thick science textbook propped against her knees. Janet and Bethany were sketching something with quiet concentration. James sighed, his heart heavy. These girls, Lisa, Mary, Janet, Bethany, and Ellie Martin, weren't just students to him. They were survivors. They had lost everything. And despite his best efforts, they were losing even more. A life of hardship. The Martin sisters had been in and out of the foster care system for years. Their parents had died in a tragic car accident when Lisa was only 10, leaving her the de facto guardian of her younger sisters. With no extended family willing to take them in, they were placed in foster homes, some kind, some cruel, but none permanent. James had first noticed them 3 years ago when Lisa, only 14 at the time, marched into his office after school. "Sir, I need a job," she had said bluntly. James, taken aback, asked, "A job? Why?" Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "So my sisters can eat." He later found out that their current foster home provided the bare minimum, just enough to keep them under one roof but not enough to care. They weren't abused, but they weren't loved either. That day, James bought them lunch and arranged for a school meal program to cover their expenses. But it was never enough. Lisa carried burdens far beyond her years. She cooked, cleaned, fought for her sisters, and took beatings meant for them in some of their harsher placements. Mary, the second oldest, learned to disappear into books, using knowledge as both an escape and a weapon. Janet and Bethany relied on their creativity, expressing through art what they could never say aloud. And Ellie, the baby of the group, hid behind her sisters, afraid to trust anyone. James had tried to help over the years. He had spoken to social workers, foster agencies, even other teachers who sympathized. But the system was broken. Now, at 16, 14, 12, 10, and 8, the girls were still drifting, caught in a cycle they couldn't escape. And James Carter was running out of ways to help them. The unthinkable idea. As James leaned against the doorway, watching them, an idea crept into his mind. It was ridiculous, unconventional, borderline impossible. But it was the only thing that made sense. He had always dreamed of having a family, but had never married. His entire life was devoted to education, ensuring kids like the Martin sisters had a shot at life. But what if he could do more than just provide them an education? What if he could give them a home? His pulse quickened at the thought. He knew the roadblocks. He was single, a man, and they were 5 black girls who had faced enough scrutiny from the world. Would people accept this? Would the system even allow it? James swallowed hard and stepped into the room. "Girls, it's late," he said softly. "You should be heading home." Lisa stiffened, a flicker of panic crossing her face before she masked it with indifference. "We're just finishing up." James folded his arms. "This is the 3rd time this week you've stayed past 6. What's going on?" Silence. Lisa exchanged a glance with Mary. Ellie's small hands clenched around her pencil. Finally, Lisa sighed, defeated. "We don't have a home anymore." James froze. "What?" Lisa's voice was low. "Our last foster home. We were removed. They said it was overcrowded." James clenched his jaw. He had heard this before. Overcrowding was often an excuse. Sometimes foster families took in children just for the government checks, and when they no longer wanted them, they made up a reason to send them away. "Where are you staying?" Lisa hesitated, then muttered, A shelter. His heart sank. He had been afraid of that answer. The backlash begins. That night, James couldn't sleep. The idea kept gnawing at him. By morning, he had made a decision. He called Child Protective Services and started the legal process. The backlash was immediate. You? A single man adopting 5 black girls. The caseworker's voice was filled with skepticism. That's highly unconventional. Unconventional doesn't mean wrong, James countered. I've known these girls for years. I've watched them suffer through foster care. They need stability. The caseworker frowned. The system doesn't look kindly on single male guardians. There are concerns. James knew what they meant. People would assume the worst. A man raising 5 girls who weren't his. The rumors would spread like wildfire. But he didn't care. The legal battle stretched for over a year. Every step was met with resistance. Investigations, background checks, psychological evaluations. At school, things grew tense. Parents whispered in the halls. Teachers exchanged looks. Some were supportive. Others weren't. A mother confronted James after a PTA meeting. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said, arms crossed. You're a respected man, Principal Carter. But this, people will talk. Another teacher, Mr. Reynolds, scoffed in the staff room. They're not even his kids. This is reckless. Even James's closest friend, Daniel, tried to talk him out of it. Man, you're throwing your career away for this. You know that, right? James stared at him. If my career ends because I helped 5 children, then maybe it wasn't worth much to begin with. The words shook Daniel into silence. Months passed. The case dragged on. The girls, though hopeful, had doubts. What if they don't let you keep us? Ellie whispered one night, curled up next to Lisa in the shelter. Lisa squeezed her hand. Then we'll run away together. Like always. But James didn't give up. And finally, after months of hearings, scrutiny, and countless interviews, the ruling came in. James Carter was officially the legal guardian of Lisa, Mary, Janet, Bethany, and Ellie Martin. The battle was over. But the real challenge had just begun. A home unlike any other. The ruling had come down in Principal James Carter's favor, but the real fight had only just begun. 5 girls, 1 man, a society that doubted them all. James stood in the hallway of his modest 2-bedroom house, his heart racing as he watched the sisters step inside for the first time. Lisa, the eldest, moved cautiously, scanning the walls like she was waiting for someone to tell her she didn't belong. Mary hovered by the door, gripping a book like a lifeline. Janet and Bethany whispered to each other, uncertain. And little Ellie, the youngest, clung to Lisa's arm, peering up at James as if he were a stranger. Because to them, he was. He had been their principal, their advocate, their protector. But now he was supposed to be their father. The first night, Lisa was the first to break the silence. This place is small, she said, her voice carefully neutral. James forced a smile. Yeah, well, it's not a mansion, but it's home. And it's yours now. The girls exchanged glances. A home. They had lived in so many different places, apartments, shelters, group homes, but none had ever felt permanent. James led them through the house. There were only 2 bedrooms, one for himself and one for the girls. He had already furnished it with 2 bunk beds, a single bed, and a corner dedicated to books, art supplies, and a small study desk. Lisa immediately gave up the larger bed, choosing instead to sleep on the floor with a blanket. I don't need it, she muttered when James protested. Ellie should have it. James didn't argue. He saw the way she carried herself, the way she had learned to put her sisters first at all costs. That night, as James lay awake in his room, he heard the whispers from the girls' room. Do you think this is real? Ellie asked in a small voice. Lisa hesitated. I don't know. But what if we have to leave again? A long silence stretched between them. Then Lisa said something that broke James's heart. "Then we won't get attached. The school turns against him." James expected challenges inside his home, but he never expected the war waiting for him at Westwood Elementary. The first sign came in the form of an email from the school board. "Mr. Carter, due to recent developments regarding your legal guardianship of 5 students, we will be conducting a review to assess any conflicts of interest in your role as principal." James stared at the screen. A review. The words were sugar-coated, but the message was clear. They didn't trust him. By the time he arrived at work the next morning, the whispers had already started. "Did you hear? He actually adopted them." "That's weird, right? A single man raising 5 teenage girls. I don't know, something doesn't sit right." Even teachers he had once considered friends began to distance themselves. And then came the meeting with Mrs. Calloway, the school superintendent. She sat across from him, fingers steepled together, her expression unreadable. "James," she said, her voice all business, "this is highly unusual." "It's legal," James countered. She sighed. "Yes, but public perception matters. Some parents are concerned." James clenched his jaw. "Concerned about what?" "That I gave 5 girls a home instead of letting them rot in the system." Mrs. Calloway looked unimpressed. "You know how people think. A single man adopting 5 black girls. They have questions." James leaned forward. "Then maybe they should ask me instead of assuming the worst." But it didn't matter. That week, an anonymous complaint was filed against him. The accusation: inappropriate conduct. Nothing with substance, just enough to raise suspicion. James was furious. He had spent 15 years building this school, helping students, mentoring teachers. And now, because he had done something good, they'd wanted to tear him down. He had expected racism, doubt, and whispers. But he hadn't expected outright sabotage. A father, not a stranger. At home, the battle was different. The girls still didn't trust him. Lisa refused to let him buy her clothes. "We don't need charity," she snapped. Mary still spoke to him like a teacher, not a father. Ellie avoided him altogether. One evening, James found Janet and Bethany huddled over a hidden envelope, whispering. When they saw him, they froze. "What's that?" he asked gently. Bethany tried to hide it behind her back, but Janet, always the blunt one, spoke up. "Money." James frowned. "Where did you get it?" Janet looked down. "From the shelter. We saved it, just in case. Just in case. In case we have to leave again." James's heart nearly shattered. They were planning for an escape because they had never been able to trust that a home would last. He knelt down. "You don't need an escape plan," he said softly. "You're home." They didn't respond because they didn't believe him. The breaking point. Everything came crashing down 2 weeks later. James was pulled into the superintendent's office again. "You're being placed on administrative leave," Mrs. Calloway said coldly. "Pending further investigation." James gripped the arms of his chair. "For what?" She slid a file toward him. Another complaint. More whispers. More people who didn't like the idea of him raising those girls. James felt the anger rise in his chest. "You're suspending me because people are uncomfortable." Mrs. Calloway didn't blink. "We have to protect the school's reputation." James stood, his fists clenched. "This isn't about the school. This is about racism, bias, and people who would rather let 5 innocent girls suffer than see a black man succeed." She didn't even deny it. James stormed out. But when he got home, things were even worse. Lisa was waiting at the door, her face pale. "You lost your job?" she asked, her voice shaking. James exhaled. "For now." Lisa looked away. "That's because of us, isn't it?" "No," James said firmly. "It's because people are afraid of change. But I don't care what they say. You're not going anywhere." For the first time, Lisa's mask cracked. "You mean that?" she whispered. James knelt down, gripping her shoulders. I fought for you. I lost for you. And I will do it again and again. Because you're my daughters now. No matter what. For the first time, Lisa hugged him. And from the hallway, the other girls watched, unsure, hopeful, and for the first time, believing. The fire that changed everything. A family under siege. James Carter had spent years fighting for the voiceless, but now he was the one under attack. The suspension from Westwood Elementary wasn't just a setback, it was an assassination of his character. And the worst part, it wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. Lisa, Mary, Janet, Bethany, and Ellie, 5 girls who had already lost everything, had been forced to watch their only protector be stripped of his dignity. James didn't know what was worse, the humiliation of the accusations or the silent pain in their eyes every time they looked at him. Lisa, always the strongest, refused to talk about it. But at night, when she thought no one could hear her, James listened to her muffled cries through the walls. And he hated himself for it. He had promised to protect them, yet he was failing. Until the fire changed everything. A fire in the dark. The night started like any other. James was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at job postings that nobody would ever hire him for. The girls were huddled in their shared room, whispering, until a loud banging on the door shattered the silence. James froze. Lisa appeared in the hallway, eyes filled with concern. "Who is that?" she whispered. James's gut told him it wasn't good. Slowly, he approached the door. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. 2 men stood outside, both in dark hoodies, faces obscured. "You don't belong here," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. James's hands curled into fists. "Excuse me." The second man stepped forward. "You think we're just gonna sit back while you turn this neighborhood into your little experiment?" James's heart pounded. This wasn't just about him adopting the girls. This was about who he was, who they were. "You got a lot of people upset, Carter," the first man continued. "And when people get upset, bad things tend to happen." James clenched his jaw. "Get off my property," he said through gritted teeth. The men exchanged a glance. And then they laughed. "Sure," one of them said. "We'll leave." And they did. But something in James's gut told him this wasn't over. The flames that tore it all down. That night, James barely slept. Every noise, every shadow, every creak of the house made him jump. He wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for them. By the time exhaustion finally overtook him, it was past 3 a.m. And that was when he smelled it. Smoke. Thick, suffocating. His eyes shot open, his brain barely processing what was happening before he heard Lisa's scream. Fire. James sprang out of bed. Flames licked the walls of the living room. Smoke billowed through the hallway. And the girls were huddled together, coughing, their eyes filled with terror. James didn't think. He acted. "Get to the back door. Now," he roared. Lisa grabbed Ellie and dragged her forward, while James scooped Bethany and Mary into his arms. Janet stumbled, coughing violently, her vision blurred by the smoke. "Janet," James bellowed. Lisa turned back, her instincts taking over. She lunged toward Janet, gripping her by the wrist and pulling her forward. The flames roared, consuming everything in their path. James shoved the back door open with his shoulder, and they burst into the night air, gasping for oxygen. The house, their home, was being devoured before their eyes. Flames danced in the windows, the roof beginning to cave in, and the fire department sirens were still too far away. And then James heard it, a faint cry from inside the house, a sound that made his heart stop cold. Ellie. A father's sacrifice. James turned before anyone could stop him. "Don't!" Lisa screamed. But it was too late. He charged back inside, the heat searing his skin. The house groaned, the walls collapsing inward. "Eli!" he shouted. He followed the sound, his vision clouded by the smoke. And then, through the haze, he saw her, curled under a table, crying. James lunged, wrapping her in his arms. "Hold on to me," he choked out. Ellie clung to him, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. James turned, but the front doorway was collapsing. They were trapped. He scanned the room, eyes darting. There, the window. James raced toward it, shielding Ellie with his body. With one final burst of strength, he crashed through the glass, shattering it with his shoulder. The impact sent them rolling into the dirt, glass embedding in his skin. Ellie sobbed against his chest, shaking violently. And then, arms grabbed them. Lisa, Mary, Janet, Bethany, all of them, crying, holding on to him. The fire roared behind them, but they were alive. The aftermath. The fire took everything. Clothes, furniture, memories. But it couldn't take what mattered most. For the first time, as they sat in the hospital room, James covered in bandages, the girls huddled around him. Lisa spoke the words he had been waiting to hear for months. "You didn't have to go back for her," she whispered. James met her gaze. "Yes, I did." Tears burned in her eyes. "Why?" she choked. And James gave her the only answer that mattered. "Because I'm your father." Lisa let out a sob, throwing her arms around him. And one by one, the others followed. Janet, Bethany, Mary, Ellie. For the first time, James wasn't just their guardian. He was their dad. And in that moment, he knew no fire, no lie, no prejudice in the world could ever take that away. Rising from the ashes, the coldest night, the fire left nothing behind. James Carter and the girls stood in the icy morning air, watching as firefighters put out the last of the smoldering ruins. Their home, gone. Lisa hugged Ellie close, protecting her from the freezing wind. Janet wiped away silent tears, while Bethany and Mary stood motionless, staring at the destruction in shock. James's body ached. His bandaged arms were covered in cuts and bruises from crashing through the window to save Ellie. The fire chief approached him. "We found traces of accelerants," he said grimly. This wasn't an accident. James already knew that. But hearing it out loud made his hands clench into fists. He glanced at Lisa, whose jaw was set in quiet rage. She had seen those men at the door the night before. She knew, just as James did, that this fire was meant to destroy more than just their house. It was meant to destroy them. "Nowhere to go." "Where will we go?" Ellie whispered, clutching James's shirt like a lifeline. James didn't have an answer. His entire savings had been wiped out trying to fight the false accusations of the school. With no job and no home, there was only one option left: the shelter. It wasn't fair. After everything these girls had endured, losing their parents, being abandoned by the system, struggling to prove they belonged, now they had to live in a place meant for the lost and broken. But James had no choice. As the cold wind howled around them, he made the hardest call of his life. The shelter's cold welcome. The Westwood family shelter was packed to capacity. James could see the suspicious stares as soon as they entered. A black man with 5 black daughters in a town that had never wanted him there in the first place. The receptionist, a frail older woman, pursed her lips. "We don't have many rooms available," she said hesitantly. James knew what that meant. "We'll take whatever you have," he said firmly. She handed him a key. 1 room. 6 people. Lisa didn't complain. She just carried Ellie inside and curled up on the thin mattress without a word. Janet and Bethany shared a blanket on the floor, while Mary took the tiny chair in the corner. James sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker in the distance. He had spent his whole life fighting for his students. Now, who was left to fight for him? The town turns its back. By the next morning, the fire had spread through the town, but not in the way James expected. People weren't talking about who had set the fire. They were talking about him. "Did you hear about the school principal? He's at the shelter now. lost everything. He brought it on himself. Should have never adopted those girls. At the grocery store, James felt the whispers. At the library, people refused to make eye contact. Even at church, where he had once taught Sunday school, the pastor only gave him a tight, uncomfortable nod. No one said it out loud, but James knew. They were waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to admit that taking in 5 black girls had been a mistake. Lisa felt it too. One evening, as they sat at the shelter's worn dinner table, she set down her spoon and whispered, "They want us gone." James sighed. Let them want. Lisa's eyes hardened. We should fight back. But how? How do you fight when the whole world wants you to disappear? The unexpected help. Then, help came from the last place James expected. Mr. Alvarez, the old janitor from Westwood Elementary, showed up at the shelter one evening. He was carrying a folder and a grocery bag filled with food. James blinked. "Mr. Alvarez." The old man nodded. "You are a good man, Mr. Carter," he said gruffly. "Still are. And good men shouldn't be left to rot." James swallowed hard. Alvarez slid the folder across the table. "What's this?" Lisa asked, suspicious. "A job," Alvarez said simply. James hesitated, flipping it open. His heart stopped. It was an application for a community rebuilding grant, a program that could give him the funding to create a shelter for at-risk youth, a program that could change everything. The betrayal. Hope flickered in James's chest for the first time in weeks. But just as quickly as it came, it was ripped away. The next morning, when James arrived at the town office to submit the application, he was met with a cruel smile. Superintendent Hargrove, the man who had orchestrated his firing, was waiting for him. "You're persistent, Carter. I'll give you that." James clenched his jaw. "Just submit the application." Hargrove laughed. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, this grant, it's reserved for people who actually contribute to the town. And you, Carter." He leaned in. "You're just a stain we're trying to scrub out." James stared him down, his blood boiling. "You burned my house down, didn't you?" Hargrove smirked. "I don't know what you're talking about." James's fists curled. But he wouldn't give Hargrove the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he turned and walked away. And as he stepped out into the cold street, Lisa ran up to him, breathless. "They turned it down, didn't they?" she asked, her voice shaking. James exhaled. "Yeah." Lisa looked away, her jaw tight. Then she whispered, "Then we'll make our own way." The plan that changed everything. That night, in their tiny shelter room, Lisa stood up. "We don't need them," she said fiercely. James frowned. "Lisa." "No," she cut him off. "Think about it. You're the best principal this town ever had. And these people at the shelter, they're just like us. They need someone to fight for them." James stared at her, realization dawning. Lisa took a breath. "Let's start our own school." James froze. Bethany and Janet lifted their heads, curiosity sparking in their eyes. "You're serious?" James asked. Lisa nodded. "Everyone thinks we're broken," she said. "Let's show them how wrong they are." James let out a slow breath. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something greater. And as he looked at the 5 girls who refused to let the world destroy them, James knew. They weren't just survivors. They were revolutionaries. The School of Second Chances. A bold idea. The shelter's dining hall was silent as Lisa stood before James and the girls. Her words still hung in the air. "Let's start our own school." James rubbed his temples, overwhelmed. "Lisa," he sighed, "it's not that simple. Schools need funding, teachers, books. Then we'll find them." Lisa interrupted, her eyes burning with determination. Mary crossed her arms. "Where? You saw what they did to the grant application. The town won't help us." "Then we don't ask the town," Lisa shot back. James exhaled slowly. He wanted to believe in Lisa's idea. But the reality was crushing. No money, no building, no approval from the school board, and most of all, no one to support them. Or so he thought. The unexpected supporters. Word spread quickly through the shelter. By the next morning, a line of people had formed in the hallway. Single mothers, struggling fathers, kids who had fallen through the cracks of the school system. A weary-looking woman in a faded coat stepped forward. "My son's dyslexic," she said. "The school just pushed him through, year after year. If you start a school, will you help him?" A man with calloused hands spoke next. "My daughter got expelled for fighting. She's not a bad kid, just angry. You willing to teach kids like her?" Then, from the back, a quiet voice. "I never learned how to read." James's heart clenched. It was Mr. Alvarez, the old janitor. He lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I cleaned the classrooms for 40 years, but I never sat in one." Lisa grabbed his hand. "Then you'll be our first student," she said fiercely. The crowd stirred. That's when James realized this wasn't just about the girls anymore. This was about all of them. The ones who had been forgotten, overlooked, discarded. Lisa was right. The town didn't want them. Fine. They'd build something better, building the impossible. Within days, James and the girls transformed the shelter's basement into a makeshift classroom. They gathered tattered chairs, old whiteboards, and donated books from whoever would help. A retired librarian volunteered to teach reading. A construction worker offered math lessons. Even the shelter's cook, an ex-chef, taught kids how to measure ingredients, turning the kitchen into a culinary classroom. Lisa handled administration, keeping everything organized. Bethany and Janet taught art and music. Mary set up science experiments with whatever scraps she could find. And James became the principal once again. No salaries, no funding. Just a dream and a basement full of students. They called it the School of Second Chances. The town strikes back. The moment the town found out, the backlash was brutal. The mayor called it an illegal operation. The police threatened to shut them down. Even parents who had once mocked James for adopting the girls suddenly cared about his school. They can't just start their own thing. They don't have real teachers. They'll turn this town into a slum. The superintendent, Hargrove, was furious. He stormed into the shelter one afternoon, slamming a notice onto James's desk. "This is an unregistered educational facility," he sneered. "I'll have it shut down by the end of the week." James stared at the paper. Lisa ripped it in half. Hargrove's face turned red. "You don't have the power to stop us," Lisa said coldly. Hargrove smirked. "Maybe not, but let's see how long you last when I cut off your supply donations." The crisis. Within days, the school was starving. The local grocery store, pressured by the town, refused to donate food. The church stopped allowing them to use its old books. Even the shelter's funding was threatened. By the second week, they were running out of everything. Supplies, money, even hope. Ellie's stomach rumbled one evening as she lay on her mattress. "We'll be okay," Lisa whispered, but she didn't sound sure. James sat alone by the window, watching the snowfall. He had fought so hard, but maybe they had lost. Then his phone rang. The call that changed everything. James picked up. A voice on the other end spoke. "Is this James Carter?" James's heart skipped a beat. "Yes. This is Claire Bennett, reporter for the National Voice. We heard about your school. Would you be willing to share your story?" James almost dropped the phone. "A national news outlet?" "Absolutely," he said, his voice shaking. "The interview that shook the town." By the weekend, James and Lisa were on TV. The reporter sat across from them, cameras rolling. "Mr. Carter, you were once the beloved principal of Westwood Elementary. Now you're running a school in a shelter's basement. Why?" James took a deep breath. "Because education isn't a privilege, he said. It's a right. Lisa leaned forward. They call us troublemakers. Outcasts. They say we're not good enough for their schools. She looked straight at the camera. We say they're wrong. The interview aired nationwide, and the entire country saw what Westwood was doing to its most vulnerable. The tide turns. Donations flooded in. Textbooks, money, supplies. Former students of James, now adults, sent letters of support. A wealthy entrepreneur from a nearby city offered a vacant building for their school, rent-free. And most importantly, the state education board stepped in. They ruled that Westwood's school board had discriminated against James and his students. The mayor was forced to back down. Superintendent Hargrove, fired. And just like that, the School of Second Chances was reborn. The ultimate victory. A year later, the school had its first graduation ceremony. Lisa stood at the podium, her voice strong and clear. We were told we didn't belong, that we were a mistake. She held up her diploma. This proves they were wrong. The audience erupted into cheers. And at the back of the room, James Carter wiped away a tear. Because after all the pain, the struggle, and the loss, they had done the impossible. They had won. The tables have turned. Years later, the town faces its own storm. Time had a way of revealing the truth. 5 years had passed since the grand opening of the School of Second Chances, and in those 5 years, Westwood changed in ways no one could have predicted. The town, once thriving under its old guard, began to crumble. Businesses shut down as younger families moved away. The local public schools, riddled with budget cuts and corruption, fell into chaos. And the very people who had once mocked James and the girls were now struggling to keep their own children educated. But the School of Second Chances, it was flourishing. Now fully accredited, it had expanded to a state-of-the-art facility, boasting the best teachers in the region, vocational programs for students with no college ambitions, free tuition for struggling families, and an open-door policy for students the public school system had failed. It was ironic. Once, James Carter had been a town outcast for taking in 5 orphaned girls. Now, his school was the last hope for many families, and they were about to find out just how much power had shifted. The former superintendent's humbling request. One rainy afternoon, James was reviewing applications in his office when a knock came at his door. He glanced up. It was Hargrove, the same man who had once tried to shut them down. James set down his pen. Superintendent Hargrove. Hargrove's face twitched at the name. He wasn't superintendent anymore. The school board had fired him after the scandal years ago. Now he looked older, tired, and, surprisingly, humble. James gestured for him to sit. Hargrove cleared his throat. I need your help, he admitted. James folded his hands. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. And yet, sitting here, he didn't feel the satisfaction he expected. Just pity. Help with what? James asked calmly. Hargrove sighed. My grandson. James raised an eyebrow. He's struggling in school. Got expelled last month. No other school will take him. He hesitated. I heard your school might. Lisa appeared in the doorway. Now a young woman in her mid-20s, she had become the school's assistant director. She crossed her arms. You tried to destroy us, she said flatly. Now you want us to save your grandson. Hargrove lowered his head. I know I don't deserve this, he muttered. But my grandson does. James and Lisa exchanged a glance. They had a choice. They could reject him, make him feel the pain they had felt all those years ago, or they could prove they were better than him. James leaned forward. What's his name? Hargrove looked up, hopeful. David, he said. His name is David. Lisa sighed. Bring him in for an interview. If he's willing to work hard, we'll give him a chance. Hargrove nodded quickly, his relief evident. And just like that, the man who once tried to destroy them had been forced to ask for their mercy. The mayor's downfall. A month later, James got another unexpected visit. Mayor Reynolds, the same mayor who had once blocked their funding, cut off their resources, and tried to bury their school. Now, he was out of office, having lost his last election. Worse, his son had just flunked out of public school. And guess where he wanted to enroll? Lisa greeted the mayor at the entrance, arms crossed. "Didn't you call our school a waste of taxpayer money?" she asked. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. That was a different time. Lisa smirked. "No, that was 5 years ago." James watched in silence. He wanted Reynolds to feel this, to understand that the very people he had once disregarded now had the power to decide his son's future. After a long pause, Lisa sighed. "We don't turn students away," she said. "Not even the ones whose parents tried to shut us down." The mayor exhaled in relief. But as he turned to leave, Lisa added one last thing. "Just remember," she said, her voice cold, "we're not the ones who needed saving." Reynolds flinched, because he knew she was right. The full circle moment. One evening, James stood outside the school, watching the sunset. Lisa joined him, arms folded. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. James chuckled. "All the time." Lisa exhaled. "You saved us." James shook his head. "You saved yourselves." Lisa smiled softly. For so many years, they had been mocked, outcast, and ridiculed. But in the end, they had won. Because kindness, perseverance, and education had outlasted prejudice, ignorance, and hate. And as the lights of their thriving school shined bright against the darkening sky, James Carter knew this was only the beginning. The legacy continues. A new chapter begins. The school of second chances had survived its battles, but James knew that survival wasn't enough. He wanted it to thrive for generations to come. And that meant one thing: expansion. One evening, he sat in his office, staring at blueprints spread across his desk. A new wing for vocational training, a community center for struggling families, a scholarship program to help students get to college. The dream had outgrown its original vision, and James was ready to take the next step. Lisa entered the office, setting down a cup of coffee. "You've been here all night," she observed. James chuckled. "I used to stay up worrying about keeping this school open." He gestured to the blueprints. "Now, I'm up planning how to make it bigger." Lisa's smile was proud. "So, what's the plan?" James leaned back. "It's time to expand beyond Westwood." Lisa raised an eyebrow. James smirked. "The world needs more schools of second chances, not just here, everywhere." The new generation steps up. As word spread about the expansion, something incredible happened. Former students began returning, offering to help. Mary, once a bookish teenager, was now a Harvard-educated lawyer. She wanted to establish free legal aid clinics at the school. Janet, the quiet artist, had become a renowned designer. She planned to create a mentorship program for young creatives. Ellie, the youngest, had grown into a brilliant scientist. She wanted to build a STEM academy in the school. Each of the 5 sisters, the very girls James had taken in years ago, were now ready to give back. Lisa watched in awe as they all gathered in James's office, eager to contribute. She turned to James. "You built something that's going to outlive us all." James simply smiled. The final challenge. Of course, not everyone was happy about their success. As the school's influence grew, so did its opposition. Old enemies from the town tried to stop their expansion. Some wealthy elites saw James's school as a threat to their private academies. Even the state government started raising barriers to their funding. Lisa clenched her fists. "They're trying to stop us, again." James, however, was calm. He had seen this before. "They can't stop us," he said simply, "because this isn't just my dream anymore. It belongs to everyone we've helped." And he was right. When the town tried to block their expansion, thousands of former students, parents, and supporters protested. The community had rallied behind them. This time, the haters lost, and the school of second chances expanded, not just in Westwood, but in 3 more cities. The principal's farewell. Years later, James Carter stood before a packed auditorium. It was the grand opening of their 4th school. Lisa, now the director of the entire foundation, stood beside him. The 5 sisters sat in the front row, beaming with pride. James stepped up to the microphone. He looked at the crowd, filled with students, parents, and alumni. He took a deep breath. "I started this school because I believed every child deserved a chance, no matter their background." He looked at Lisa. At first, it was just a dream. Then it became a fight. He turned to the 5 sisters. "But today, it's a movement." The crowd erupted in cheers. James smiled softly. His work was done. He was retiring, knowing that the future was in good hands. Lisa leaned over. "You're really stepping down," she teased. James chuckled. "It's not stepping down," he said. "It's passing the torch." As he walked off the stage, he knew. The school he built, the lives he changed, and the legacy he left behind would last forever.